The cloud. All right, tonight we have Marla Day. Marla Day received her bachelor's and master's degree in apparel and textile marketing with a design specialization from Kansas State University. In 2003, she accepted an appointment as senior curator for the K-State Historic Costume and Textile Museum in the Department of Apparel, Textiles, and Interior Design, College of Human Ecology, Kansas State University. Marla has also served as a textile specialist to the Smithsonian's Save Our African American Treasures program, an initiative of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. Marla currently serves on the state board of the Kansas Museum Association, and she gave an incredible presentation on 1920s clothing a couple of years ago for us for a temp exhibit called Turbulent 20s, and we're so pleased to welcome her back tonight. So everybody give a virtual round of applause for Marla Day. Take it.
All right. Well, thank you, Andrew. That was lovely. Although I probably need to update that because my college has actually changed name in the meantime. So, but anyway, but thank you. And I'm thrilled that Johnson County has the exhibit now on in their temporary gallery, and it will be up and open. And I hope you have a chance to go by and see it. But you know, thrifting and upcycling are not new concepts for us. The practice of reusing empty feed sacks, flour sacks, and sugar sacks, also known as commodity bags, as a raw material for clothing and other home goods was popular during the austere decades of the 1920s through the 1940s. Thrift style, we have included over 4 dozen examples of the collision between commercial waste and homespun ingenuity, perhaps providing a model for our modern emphasis on sustainability. And so with that, I'm going to, I wanted to say thank you to Johnson County Museum for hosting the exhibit, and to Richard D. Rees. He's a K-State alumni, and you'll hear a little bit more about Dick, as he's known, and his wife Janet. And then thank you to Exhibits USA for picking up thrift style and taking it to this new audience where it will travel the US for the next 5 years. I thought we'd start with a little bit of a discussion about, you know, what do I mean by feed sack versus flour sack or a commodity bag? Basically, it's all one thing, kind of sifted down, and it commonly can be referred to as either. So they're all talking basically about the same type of bag. So whatever it was to hold grain, feed, or flour, sugar, salt, any staple. But I wanted to start off with just a little bit of history of how our feed and flour sack collection began at Kansas State University with the Historic Costume and Textile Museum. So this is Dick and Janet Rees. This is a photo of them on their honeymoon. And they had a love affair that lasted for many years. And unfortunately, Janet passed away a few years ago. And Dick was looking for a new home for some of her beautiful clothes that she had. And he came across an article that was written by my college, and because he's an alumni of K-State, and it mentioned the Historic Costume and Textile Museum. He contacted me, and that started a friendship that continues to this day. And so thank you, Dick. I hope you're out there listening. But this is a photo as Dick, Richard, Robert, and Leonard Rees, and they had a Leonard had a feed store in Coffeyville, Kansas, and his 2 young sons helped in the business. And one of the things that just in chatting with Dick about some of the various holdings that we have in our museum, I had mentioned feed sacks, and you know, of course, that rang a bell with him, and then he shared the story, and I said, well, you know, we have a few, but we really don't have very many. Well, needless to say, we now have a lot, and it's all because of Dick Rees. And our collection focuses on Kansas mills and feed sacks from Kansas and that kind of thing. But But the boys are pictured here with their dad in the feed store truck used at the family's feed store business. The two sons, Robert and Richard, were active in 4-H, and Richard earned many leadership honors and national recognition awards through the 4-H program. As the boys were growing up, they worked at the feed store. So this is where our Feedstack story really begins. This image is of Richard and his older brother, Robert, and it was taken on a family trip to Montana during the summer of 1950. And Dick would have been about 12 years old and his brother, 14. The vacation was planned around a business conference their father, Leonard, would attend. The family traveled through Colorado, Wyoming, Idaho, and Utah, visiting historic sites and helping out at a ranch owned by a family friend. If you'll notice in the sign where the boys are standing, those shirts that they're wearing are made by their mother, Beatrice, using the feed sacks from their store. And unfortunately, we don't have those shirts, but I wish we did. So here's just a fun photo of where the boys stayed while they were out on that ranch in the summer of 1950. And again, they're wearing feed sack shirts that Beatrice had made. So why were feed sacks useful? And did people keep them around? Well, they were practical and utilitarian. The amount of the free fabric they provided made them very desirable. It could be made into pillows or shoe bags or table linens, in addition to clothing, curtains, and even toys. So, looking at the humble beginning of the feed sack, how did it get started? Well, it all started because of wooden barrels. That's how goods were shipped across the continental United States and probably abroad as well. But it was transported in the large wooden barrels. And even though there might have been varying sizes of those barrels, everything from 96 pounds to 48 to 24 and things like that, you still had this lovely wooden barrel, which itself is quite repurposeful. But the problem was what happened whenever the barrels were empty. They still took up the same amount of space to store. So enter the feed sack. And so this was a slide from one of the Bagology, which was a trade publication for the industry. Well, if you can see on that lower left, that bundle that looks like it's baled, that's hundreds of feed sacks all bundled and bound together versus the size of the wooden cask. So it made much more sense to have a product that would move the grain or the flour and then collapse down to something that didn't take up as much space to store. And still provided a sturdy way to transport those goods. But it wasn't going to be able to be transported until this machine. And this is a drawing of the lock stitch sewing machine that was developed by Elias Howe in 1845, and he patented it in 1846. And it was the first machine that produced a reliable chain stitch. And if you'll notice, that image is cranked by hand, and it used very coarse, thick thread. So I took a close-up of what that looked like. So here you're seeing one side of what the stitch would look like. So it looks like a regular sewing machine stitch on one side. And then on this side is the reverse of that stitch. And you can see where it looks much more like a chain. And that's the chain stitch. And that stitch, you can see they would trail it off to one end and then cut it. So it's not like a sewing machine where you lifted a presser foot and then pulled it out and then cut the thread. You had to chain stitch it off and then they would cut it. This slide I wanted to show you because even though it's a badly stained sack, it's still one that's a nice example of some of the early printing that was done on the sacks. This particular one is a toweling sack, so that red stripe that's in there is actually made from red yarns that are woven in whenever the fabric was on the loom. So it makes it a much more durable stripe for that color to stay in there. And then the idea with the printed logo on the sack was that it would provide a way for people could reuse the sack and get the logo out, even though there are all kinds of fun stories about trying to get those out. And I wanted to share this image because this is an example of what you might see designed for a feed sack or a flour sack in this case. And so there were bag companies, of which Kansas and Missouri probably had over a dozen companies that produce these bags. And there's still bags made in the state of Kansas with Hutchison or Hubco bag company. But this one, it shows the artist's rendering in its somewhat final form and any changes that would be made before it would be sent out to be printed. So the practice of reusing these became especially popular, and now there's a really strong collector's market for bags, and even the fabric remnants from these bags. Quilters love their vintage prints. These are some of the printing plates that we have in our holdings for the museum, and the Hudson or the Stafford County Flour Mill and their Hudson Perfection Flour. This is their printing plate. And these are usually destroyed by the printers after, you know, they get used up and things. So these are actually quite rare, but this would be depending upon the number of colors that a company would want to have printed. So, you know, your basic colors are red, yellow, and blue, and then you combine blue and yellow to get green and various things like that. But for each different color that you wanted to have on your screen, you would need a printing plate, and it would have to go through that printing process. So, you know, it might be 3 colors or 4 colors to get to that. So this is a Barton County Flour Mills. They're from Great Bend, Kansas. This bag was made by Percy Kent at one of the Kansas City operations, Feedstack sack manufacturers. And they like to focus on specialty bags like this one, because on the back side of this sack, which you'll see in the exhibit, is printed with an embroidery design. But before there were printed logo bags, it was just those plain cotton bags. This particular sack is from the H.D. Lee Flour Mills in Salina, Kansas. And hopefully you're familiar with the Lee name, and especially those of you there in Johnson County in the Kansas City area, because that is what would become Lee Jeans and that kind of thing. But the Fulton Bag Company, this one's made by the Fulton Bag and Cotton Mill of Kansas City, Kansas, and it made this sack expressly for the H.D. Lee Flour Mill. And his mercantiles started in 1895, and by 1893, he has established the flour mill for the profitable use of grain it had received in trade for milling grain. So a miller would commonly take part of the proceeds of grinding grain into either cornmeal or flour into flour. They would take a part of that and then they would resell it, and that's how these companies had got that grain, that product. And Lee flour mills will go on to become Lee Jeans. This is a fun sack because it's commemorates the Santa Fe Trail, and it's from the Kansas Milling Company in Wichita, Kansas. But up there in the left-hand corner of that logo is an Nra stamp, and that was a stamp that the company put on their bag, saying that we will do our part for the National Recovery Association. It was part of a New Deal agency, and they were created for fair practice codes in business. And it only was used during 1933 to 1935. So we know that that sack dates to that time period. And so that's one of the ways that we can date it. This is also a 98-pound sack. And let me go back just a second. This one's a 24-pound sack. And those are still the sizes that correlate to the wooden cast, the keg sizes. And after World War II, or during World War II, those become standardized sizes and becomes the 100-pound, the 50-pound, the 25-pound that we're more familiar with today. So that's one of the ways that we have to help us date a sack. Some of these early sacks, they would have information on them to tell you how to repurpose and to use the sack. So the image there on the left, it says, cut the last 2 stitches, remove the center stub, unravel it by pulling both the blue and the white strings at the same time so that you could easily get that chain stitch out. And if you've ever worn a pair of ready-made pants and the hem gave out, it's because it was a chain stitch similar to what this is. And so once you pull the right thread, or in the case of your hem, the wrong thread, it immediately starts to unravel. And then the image over here on the right is the string 2 is worth saving. So that's from advice from a bag of tricks for home sewing that they encouraged women during the 20s through the 40s and perhaps even later on to find ways to reuse even the string. Because remember, I said it was that coarse string. You could actually, they gave you patterns to make crocheted doilies and crocheted edgings on pillowcases and things like that. So thrifting was encouraged. So these are 3 sacks in our holdings, and one of them, maybe 2 of them, are in the exhibit. This Hudson cream one is definitely in the exhibit, but these are examples of the toweling that sacks were made out of. So for these, you could simply open the side of the bag and then cut along that fold, and you could end up and rehem it, and then have 2 new dish towels. And these still make great dish towels if you can find them. Excuse me. Printed bags, the ones with a pretty pattern on them, didn't really come into being until the mid-1920s. And this is a copy of the patent that Asa Bales filed in 1925. He was granted a patent in 1926. And his concept was to print the fabric with a pattern, but he specifically stated that the design was for gingham. And because he worked for Gingham Girl Flour, and so it made sense to him that he would patent this idea, and that therefore it would protect the company and that kind of thing, and perhaps he earned royalties, I don't know. But so the patent only related to the idea of gingham. But other companies took notice, and because the sales of Gingham Girl Flour took off like crazy, and all kinds of little dresses were made for everybody. This is a copy of the Gingham Girl Flour incentive that I was able to find. And so you can get an idea of what their gingham looked like. And it started out in red, but then it proceeded to be green and blue and purple and all kinds of colors. And this is an image we're all familiar with. We've seen it out there. I was trying to find the attribution for this, but this one is from the internet. But you can see what sacks of flour and all the different prints and things like that that could be available and stacking up in a warehouse. And so if you think back to where I mentioned that Dick and his brother had to move these to get the particular sack that perhaps the customer was wanting so that it worked with some of the other flour sacks that they were trying to make into dresses or something for their family, they had a bit of work to do. But I just thought it was fun. And then if you'll note that that one right in front of him that has the cherries on it, that'll kind of relate to one that we're going to see in a few minutes. So this image is just a printed flour sack. So this is what we're going to, so instead of having the printed logo on the sack, we're now seeing these more of a label with the pretty prints on the design. But I also wanted to include this one because now sacks are not only with a white sack with a printed label, they're now beginning to offer them in colors. And this is actually from Coffeyville, Kansas. Now it's not the, unfortunately it's not from Dick's family's store, but this is one of the first colored bags used in the animal feed industry. And also in 1926, we know that because of the victory bag and that kind of thing. But, oh, excuse me, that this sack, the first bags were in 1926 for colors. So this particular bag, because it is the victory bag that's over on the left, is from 1941. So again, we've had a transition in how they're putting the labels onto these bags, and it's all because of the consumer market, because they're driving this because they want it to be easier ways for them to be able to use the sack. So instead of it being printed on, the label printed on there or stamped on there with ink, and then housewives are trying to get that ink out, they came up with this label, and it's called a band label, and it's sewn into the, glued and sewn into the side seam, and it was much easier to get off. You could soak it to get it off, and also whenever the bags were stacked on top of each other, you could read on the side what the product was, so it made it easier to sort it out. And then we get to an even smaller label, and this is an example of Paramore's Best Egg a Day Laying Mash, and this is from Delphos, Kansas. But isn't it a pretty little sack? Charming print. So Feedstacks provided some creative solutions for the household. So this is an example of a dress that's image that's in the exhibit, but I wanted to show you some detailed shots of it so that you could see the printing on this flour sack that was used. But every bit of this dress is made from a flour sack. So the color is likely dyed, hand-dyed using ground Osage, orange, or perhaps walnut, depending upon the mordant that was used. That was used to help set the dye. But if you'll notice, all of those stitches are done by hand, and the thread is the thick, coarse thread that was used to sew the sack together. So it's a beautiful example. So if you get a chance to go into the exhibit, they've fixed it so that you can sort of try this piece on. And and here's a close-up of the front, so you can kind of see how it was put together. But that's from 1870, and the sack was from Council Grove, Kansas. And these are examples of two of the booklets that were out there for women to use when making things for their home or for their families. The one on the left, A Bag of Tricks, is from 1945. The Make and Mend, it was printed during the war, World War II. but within them, they have great fun ideas. So if you ever come across one of these in an antique store, perhaps in your family's collection, there's some really fun ideas on how to repurpose and mend and things like that. One of these even tells you how to darn stockings and socks. So I thought I'd share a few of the photos of those, but here's some of the ideas. But they would give you pattern numbers for some ready-made patterns that were out there and available. And then it would tell you how many sacks that you would need to be able to make that particular style. But these were used as promotions. One was the Cotton Council. I think the other one's by a thread company. But making things for baby, for toys, for your tea towels, and your children. So lots of good ideas. But this particular dress is not in the exhibit. But there is another one that is, and it was made by the same person. But this is an example of a Feedstack made dress. And so I'm kind of giving you an image of the dress. And because it's a busy, busy print, you don't get to see all of the fine details of where some of the telltale marks of where the Feedstack stitching is. But I thought on the inside of this dress, along that seam line, you can see where those needle holes are. That's the original stitch line using that chain stitch. And so it's sort of like it needle punched it. And they're pretty permanent within that fabric. And so it was the job of the seamstress to try to find ways to disguise those as best they can. So this particular dress has pockets, and you can find some of the holes that are on the back side of the fold at the pocket facing, and within the front opening, the front placket, you can find them. But this particular one at the waistband was the best example of seeing those needle holes to confirm for sure that this was a Feedstack print. This is an example of underwear that might have been made out of a Feedstack. I don't know the story of this one, but this pair I do. This is Velma was learning to sew. I'm going to tell you a story. And Velma made for her sister Nelda a pair of bloomers or underwear. The fabrics available to her were provided by trips to town with her father to select Feedsacks in prints she liked. The family raised chickens, and buying several 100-pound sacks at a time was necessary. Wearing bloomers made from plain Feedsacks was a common practice as families stretched clothing budgets. Getting the mill logo that had been printed onto the cloth out was a challenging process. The slight remnants of the clover logo can be seen on the the left half of the bloomers. And according to Velma, the bloomers were likely made of chicken feed sacks the family bought at the local feed mill. And the bloomers were recently donated to the Historic Costume and Textile Museum. So this is an image of on the left of Nelda. She was the youngest of 6, and the family lived on a farm and raised chickens during the Great Depression in the Dust Bowl stricken areas of the Midwest. And then over there is Velma and Nelda with the cat. So here is an image of those little bloomers on a mannequin. So you kind of get an idea of how they fit. But I thought if I would read you an ode to flour sack underwear. When I was just a maiden fair, Mama made our underwear. With many kids and Dad's poor pay, we had no fancy lingerie. Monograms and fancy stitches did not adorn our Sunday breeches. Panty waist that stood the test had swans down on my breast. No lace or ruffles to enhance, just jockey oats on my pants. One pair of panties beat them all, for it had a scene I still recall. Chickens were eating wheat right across my little seat. Rougher than a grizzly bear was my flour sack underwear. Plain, not fancy, and 2 feet wide, and tougher than a hippo's hide. Although the depression, Jill and Jack wore the sturdy garb of sack. Waste not, want not, we soon learned that a penny saved is a penny earned. There were curtains and tea towels too, and that is just to name a few. But the best beyond compare was my flour sack underwear. So this is a photo of Velma, and you can see she's a little older in this photo, and it's from 1938. And I actually was able to speak with Velma recently, and so she was shared these images of her and her 4-H sewing entries for the county fair. And the dresses she had sewn were made from Feedstacks. And Velma was mostly self-taught to sew, but she did have help using patterns from an older sister, Edith. So this is clothing that's in the exhibit, and this is clothing that was made for Janet Smith by her grandmother. And so it's a little romper with a bonnet, and then there's another bonnet over there as well. And they're just charming. These Feedstack prints are the cutest things. And her grandmother was so talented. Oh, there. And these were all made by the grandmother as well. So the bias binding is typical for the time period and was featured in many of those brochures that I was showing you earlier. The one on the left and on the right are both for adults, and then the one in the middle was made for Janet. It's a smaller size, but all from Feedstacks. And even this is a more contemporary piece, and perhaps some of you in the audience might recognize the style, but this is probably dates to that late 1960s, early 70s time period because of the bell-bottom pants. But if you look closely at the graphics that are on that one pantsuit, that's Feedstack labels. And so it became a fashion trend to recycle that idea of Feedstacks and those logos during that time. So this is a close-up of that bag of tricks. So looking now at finding some creative solutions that they did for the household. This is a quilt in the exhibit. This was donated by Dick, was made by, it's a family quilt, and it's just beautiful. All of these flowers are made from different Feedstacks. All the little containers where the flowers are based are all made out of plaids, and the others are all prints, and it's just a really charming applique quilt. And this is another one that was sewn by Janet's grandmother, Sevilla Smith Fisher, and great aunt Eva Norfleet, and perhaps a maternal grandmother, Catherine Geyer Bowen. And this was made from Feedstacks and using both solids and prints. And what's interesting about this is the face of the quilt, and this is the back of the quilt, which is made with these border print sacks. And you only get to see a little portion of this in the exhibit. So I wanted to be sure you all saw the full back of the quilt. And then I've included a little drawing over here on the left, but it was made from 4 100-pound sacks. And then she had to use a strip of plain cloth down the middle to make it wide enough for the quilt front and to go across the bed that she was putting it on. But I think it's a really ingenious way, because with the way that the printed looks, you don't even notice that there's any plain fabric in the middle. But there's that little cherry print that we saw in the 1939 print of the man in the warehouse with the sacks. This is a fun sack because this is a border print. So this would be what the back of the quilt that we just saw with the border prints. This is what a sack would have looked like based on that same concept. And so the image over on the right from the trade publication kind of would stimulate ideas for seamstresses to use to create things for their home. And so this smaller image is a placemat that one of the grandmothers, or perhaps Janet, might have embroidered herself with her name. And then over here is a feed sack or flour sack that has would be either 2 long strips that could have been made into tea towels, or it would have, you could have cut it to make 4 individual placemats. Other ideas for things that feed sacks were used for in the home are garment bags like this one. And this was came to us from Marilyn Golly. And her aunt had made this particular sack, excuse me, this garment bag from Saks while she was a 4-H'er, and she had entered this in her county fair. So this was made in the early 1930s by Sarah Ann Pence. And so I gave you a little detailed shot of some of her excuse me, stitching so you can see that detail. And it buttoned up the front. This is one of the ideas that was included in that earlier previous slide. This is a shoe bag, and so this is what you could have put your shoes in if you were going to pack them and take them somewhere. And this is the back of that one sack that I had shown you earlier with the embroidery on the back of it. This is in the exhibit, and if you can imagine, this particular feed sack is still sewn along the side. Now, I think it's fun because it's an unfinished project, but it was saved. And I can't imagine, because the bottom of the bag is underneath where the embroidery is. And so that embroidery was done in a tunnel. And why you wouldn't have opened that bag up to doing that embroidery, I don't know. But it is what it is, and it's got a charming story now. But I unfortunately, I don't know who did the embroidery, but I think it's sweet. These are other things that you might see either in your home or at the antique store, and they're highly collectible. And these are a collection of pot holders. Pretty fun. This is 2 images. Now, the one on the right is a clothespin bag, well, they're both clothespin bags, but the one on the left is currently on Etsy. So you could still buy things like this today, and I think that's pretty charming and pretty sweet. So now we're going to talk about some creative ideas for us to use. And so I used this book. I had been looking for, ideas to include in the presentation. And this book was really helpful because she talks a lot about sustainable fashion and slow fashion, which is not maybe following the trend so much, but mending and mindful purchases, I guess I should say. And I think this quote from the book by Laura Yates is very meaningful to me, because clothes worth wearing are worth repairing. And I think that kind of says it all. So perhaps you'll start sewing those buttons on and mending those rips and tears and things like that to make things last a little longer. But this was an image from the book that I thought was kind of fun, because a lot of these new trends in repairing clothing, they're using hand stitches, and it's not that they're all perfect either. And so I wanted to stress that to perhaps people in the audience that might be intimidated by that, to just start. But And then this was a book that I found really, really helpful. So I'll share several of the slides, and I was truly inspired by it. But Mending Matters by Katrina Rodabaugh. And so the image of the little boy you're seeing is from the book. And so it's kind of showing what happens with little boys' jeans. And the image on the right, those are my grandson's jeans and some of the repairs that I've done for that. And so it is, I have repaired jeans for husband, son-in-laws, daughters, now grandchildren. And I have 5 grandchildren, so 4 boys, 1 girl. We'll see right now I have 7 pairs of jeans to repair, but I've been doing it on the machine. I may have to look at doing it another way. So this, the image of the jean tote bag on the left is actually a bag I made a few years ago. And I had some jeans that were pretty worn out and I needed some patching material. So I decided I would turn the big part of the jean into a tote bag. And so you're seeing my work over there. And then the image of the young woman walking is from the Mending Matters book, and it's another idea for taking and making a tote bag. And there you could use like perhaps a longer length of a pant leg to make that bag as big as you need it. But I thought that was a fun example. And then the one on the left is a jean jacket from the Mending Matters book, but just showing how you can incorporate perhaps some of the what you think is irreparable damage, and if you use some fun fabrics behind it, it can find another life and tell another story. And then the other one is a bag that I have made and put in a charity auction, and it's made from a Levi's pair of jeans, and I turned it into a trendy little shoulder bag, and I lined it with a bandana print that also was recycled. And so I just wanted to show these because it was more examples of ideas of how to make these repairs and sew it by hand. And menswear, men's jeans too. So Andrew, get your needle ready. And this is made from a garment that was linen. And so something had happened to the whatever linen garment that was, and the Mending Matters book suggested making perhaps a scarf out of what was left. And so you don't always have to think, just repair. Perhaps it's time to cut it up and make it into something else. And then this one was fun, a rechargeable bag or a recharging bag for your phone. But you could also turn this into a shoulder bag if you put a longer strap on it, and then you'd have a way to carry your phone, perhaps while you're out taking a walk or something like that. And you could use the side seam from that pair of jeans where it's got that really strong stitch. And then my daughter got me hooked on these. Now, these are kids' jeans, and some of the patches that are out there, and we got these images from Etsy, and so she's like, Mom, would you make the boys some of these? And I said, I will, but I'm not sewing the buttons on them. I just think that would be a train wreck. I could see broken buttons, but you can see the other image, it has maybe felt eyes and that kind of thing. So that's what my plan is. So this is an example of one that I have in process. So you can see this was one of the pair of jeans, and then down here is my repair that I made him into one of the little monsters. And then I stitched it by hand with thread that more matches the jeans, just because I wasn't confident in my stitching. Then this one was a project during the first part of the pandemic. I was needing to have my hands busy with all the time that I had at home and being confined. And so I went rummaging through my pattern stash and came across this indigo junction pattern. And all my grandkids were at that time under the age of 5. none of them can tie their shoes. And, you know, so many of them are learning to just do some of these tasks. So I got out the pattern and started scrounging up, and this is all from my sewing stash. And the t-shirt is what I used to make the hair. The pattern had suggested just tearing fabric. And so I knew that if you took a jersey t-shirt and cut it into strips and pulled it, that it would curl. And so I cut it into strips and pulled it, and then just lined them all up to make the hair. And I tell you, that's the best feature that the kids love. So if you want to know more about recycling denim, I've given you a link here. So if you do go to that YouTube and look and watch that, I would suggest looking at this organization's page, because it's actually promoted by the Cotton Council of America, and you can actually package up and send them your jeans and they will recycle them. And what they're doing is making home insulation out of the recycled denim, as well as turning it back into new denim, much like what they used to recycle wool. So there's a link for you to follow about that. And then I'm including some more images here of ways that people are making products now that are available for sale in there. And so if you've ever gone to the produce market, you can see that there's apple labels, there's potatoes and things. You can actually cut those plastic labels and you can still sew that with your sewing machine. And this is backed with a fabric and made into a shoulder bag. So a fun way to repurpose current sacks. You'll even find these with horse feed, dog feed, and things like that. So if you go onto Pinterest or Etsy, you'll find these. This was an example of if you've ever had grandchildren and they're puller fleece, or you have scraps from your where you've made garments, you could actually make you some nice and cozy little house shoes. This is a t-shirt that's turned into a shopping bag, but it's sliced, so kind of like the way I was describing with the t-shirt earlier, but it's just slashed, and then whenever you put anything heavy into the bag, it stretches and makes it look more mesh-like. But this is made from a t-shirt. Now, this is actually a garment that I wore tonight. And this was one of my favorite ensembles that I would wear whenever I would go out and give programs and things like that. And the slide in the middle, if you look closely, you can see a white spot. Well, it got bleached when it was down in my laundry. And so I was so disappointed, and it was like, what am I going to do? I loved this vest. And so I thought about cutting it up, or, you know, just getting a pattern from it. And then a couple of years later, a dear friend of mine gave me a gift, and it was wrapped in fabric that she had hand dyed. And so I took that fabric and I was like, you know, it's the same color as and I think I can make it work into that. And so I came up with this concept and applied it to this vest. And so now I get more compliments on it now than I ever did. So, you know, when life gives you lemons, you make lemonade. So I forgot to start my timer, but Andrew, so do we have any questions?
Just getting my camera going back again. Marla, that's incredible. You wore something that you created yourself. That is so cool. You know, I really loved the end of your presentation, because ingenuity in hard times doesn't have to mean hard times of the past. We always immediately think of, you know, the Great Depression and World War II, but there are hard times happening right now for folks. And so seeing some of those modern examples are really, it's really inspiring. So I appreciate you sharing that. We do have some questions. I encourage you folks, if you have questions, to throw them in the chat. We can read them out loud for Marla. Let's see. So some of the ones that I saw were the sacks made of soft cotton. The question asker was thinking that it was probably so. They were soft, but then the Bloomer poem
Yeah.
made her think again, maybe.
Well, it's kind of a combination. The lighter sacks, they are those nice, soft kind of, I will call them calicos just because they did become more soft. But the toweling sacks were a thicker weave and they were more dense. And some of those earlier sacks were as well. So it really kind of depends on what was going to go inside the bag, what they might use to make the sack out of.
Gotcha. When did they stop making the large cloth bags, or do they still make them? And are they still colorful if they're being made?
They're still made. I mentioned the Hutchison Bag Company in Hutchison, Kansas, still makes sacks. I'm sure there's probably others out there as well, but they make them for the gourmet specialty market, and everything from little bitty ones like this to, you know, much larger sacks. But, you know, so they're still out there, but much more of it's, you know, made with plastic now.
Yeah, yeah.
Or paper.
That was a question that I had. So thinking about, you know, you gave some great examples of things that you could recycle or repair to be able to keep using and reuse. But thinking about what's the modern equivalent of the Feedstack bag today? What would you say? What material or product is something that is reusable in the same way and could yield so many different options for somebody?
I would probably, there's some of the animal bags, that horse, cow, pig, you know, all of those farm animals, they still sell grain or their feed in sacks, and they're made from a really nice, you know, plastic sack. And some really enterprising people have, you know, make them into other things. Unfortunately, they're plastic, so they'll be around for a long time. So, you know, it's nice that somebody's finding a way to repurpose them.
Yeah.
But yeah.
How can somebody tell? Let's see. How can I tell which are Feedstack fabrics in my 1930s quilts?
It's really hard to tell. And I meant to show you guys, with my
There you go.
background, you can't see it. I use this book by Gloria Nixon, Feedstack Secrets. This one by Edie McGinnis, who is these two ladies are both from Kansas. Edie lives in Kansas City, and Gloria, last I knew, lived in Topeka, Kansas. And so it was lovely to get to meet both of them during the research on both the exhibit and during some presentations I have given. And they both shared their collections. But this book by Lindsay Cole McCrae is like my Bible. And in this book, if you can't find the little telltale hole signs on your sack, my next place that I go is just one of these references books and look for examples of that they have in there. And in the back of the McCrae book, maybe if I'm not going to mess with the technology. But it has all these pictures of examples of different Feedstack prints. But you can kind of tell, because I mean, the colorways are all pretty much the same from the, you know, you can kind of see the 20s ones, the 30s ones, and the 40 ones after you kind of develop an eye for that. So those are some books that are great reference materials.
That last book you talked about, there's a series of books that are shipped with the exhibit as it travels, and that is just a gorgeous book. The images are really interesting, and then the patterns in the back are just beautiful, the sample. When can you give us an idea of when the big change came from cloth to the paper or plastic bags that we see today, especially in feed sacks?
Well, probably I would say it started in the late 40s and early 50s because people, you know, the cloth bags do rip. I mean, you know, they're you put enough stress on it, it will break. But so they started using paper bags, and some of the early feeds are, as part of that transition from cloth to paper, they might even underline the fabric with paper. And we have one example of those. But it probably, I would say, in the late 40s, early 50s, it went to paper. And that's what we still use today. When you go get your flour and sugar at the store, it's in a paper bag.
Yeah. There's two different questions that I think go together. One was, did the bags leak? They were thinking the fabric could be porous. And then kind of the flip side of that, did families have to deal with insects in their feed sacks?
They could, and that can happen even with paper in terms of the insects. But, I would say that had more to do with, where it was stored in the home and things like that. And you just had to keep a watch on it. And so, it's always better if you can store something in something that's airtight so that the bugs couldn't get in and that kind of thing. But, yeah, bugs could be a problem. And then the first part of that question was, did the bags leak? Perhaps if you pounded it hard enough that you might get a puff of flour, or if it was animal feed, you get a puff of the crumbs and things like that. But it really was a pretty tightly woven fabric. It's maybe not quite as tightly woven as the very best quilt cottons that we might have today, that we would have in our collection. But it was still better, still good. And so.
Sure, it must have worked well. They had them for several decades.
Oh, they made millions.
And were they all made of cotton, or were other fibers used over time?
Well, there are jute ones, the burlap bag, which, potatoes and onions and things like that would have been shipped with, in perhaps burlap, beans, rice, well, maybe not rice and burlap, but, yeah. And we have a few early examples of burlap bags, but, burlap's always messy and it usually smells. So,
Probably wouldn't have been too comfortable either.
You wouldn't want to wear it.
Great questions, guys, coming in the chat. I encourage you to keep throwing them in there. In prep for this exhibit, I'd read an article, and I cannot remember the author's name, but part of it was talking about how women who lived on farms, women who lived in rural areas, were in some ways choosing the designs, influencing fashion. They may not be able to get to a department store to buy ready-made clothing, or they may not be able to purchase expensive textiles to make their own out of, fancy printed clothing, but they were still influencing that. Can you talk a little bit about, as bags begin to have patterns and colors and things, that process of bringing designers in?
Well, sure. And the bag manufacturers realized that they really had a market for this, and the flour feed and mill companies decided that it was such a great promotional tool, because to make a garment for an adult, it might take 2, 3, or 4 bags, and if you needed a lot of fabric, you needed it to come in 100 pounds. So whatever, you had to get, say, 300 pounds of flour, so you had 3 bags of the same print. And so then you had to, but people did a lot more baking, a lot more cooking at home, kind of like what we've experienced this last year. So they had more available. And, if you lived on a farm, I showed some examples of where feed came, and there was the chickens. If you kept chickens, then you would go through a lot more feed sacks. And so, it was the job of the daughters and the sons, and perhaps because mom didn't always get to go to town, but she might send swatches of a sack with dad, who was going to town to get the feed, and to try to find either prints that coordinated or particular matches for that. And so that's why women were having, to dig through these bags to get the prints. And so they were so popular. And so that sold a lot of product. And so it was really market driven by the way that these were used. And so I think I read in McCrae's book that as it's estimated that there were, 7 to 8 million bags of different prints made from the 20s through the 40s. That's a lot of prints. And so that's why we don't have any one definitive guide that shows them all, so we could all go, okay, this is a Feedstack.
Yeah. And so were they changing out seasonally patterns and things, or just sort of?
I would say it was more, it could change seasonally, but it was more trends in color. Nowadays, we still follow certain color trends. You can, we have a color of the month or a color of the year, and that we were still influenced by these color trends.
Thanks. Let's see. Somebody asked, I've heard that farmers could sell their sacks back to the mills and people could buy empty bags. Is that true?
Yes. There were swap parties as well. And Dick says that his dad would put a table out and where people could bring sacks in. I don't know whether he bought them or they could trade for them. That they would have a way for you to try and get the sacks that you wanted and that kind of thing. But it became really popular to have swap parties. And especially if it was always nice if you lived in a city, if you knew people that were out on the farm, or, perhaps a farmer's wife might advertise in the classifieds in the newspaper that she not only had eggs for sale, but she had extra feed sacks, that she could sell them to get, generate a little income. But yeah, people sold them and resold them.
It's really interesting. So a lot of this, we talk about farmers because of feed and different products and things, but during the Depression, during World War II, how widespread was this practice? I mean, how many people who weren't living on farms?
Good question. Well, fabrics were rationed just like clothing, ready-made clothing was rationed. So the L45 regulations limited the amount of fabric that could be put into ready-made garments, but there was also protections in place for and the new patterns that came out, they had to meet those same restrictions. So you couldn't make garments that had a circle skirt on them and that kind of thing. And if you did make the garment with a circle skirt, then you looked rather ostentatious to your neighbors that you were using all of that fabric to make that particular garment. So fabric was in limited supply because it was all going to the war effort. But what wasn't limited were feed sacks and flour sacks and sugar sacks and salt sacks. There were never any restrictions on the use of these sacks. And so it was a market for consumers to be able to make clothing or whatever it was they needed for their home using these materials provided. So it was an answer to the needs of many. Good question.
Yeah, thank you. Let's see. So if folks were using feed sacks to create their clothing, where were they getting their patterns for dresses and other clothing and things?
Well, a lot of times you could get them, newspapers would carry advertisements. I was trying to think of some of the names for those, but there would be advertisements for dresses, and they're usually on the society or women's page of the newspaper. And if it wasn't a daily paper, then it was certainly on the Sunday paper where it listed those, where you could mail order and get that particular pattern and get it sent to you.
Neat.
In addition to our typical Simplicity, Butterick, McCall's.
I'm going to put out a last call for questions. And then I just want to, let's see, does anyone collect or repurpose the logo bags? And I think this is a good chance for you to talk a little bit about the collection that you work with and maybe the types of bags you have, how many bags you might have, sacks.
Yeah, how many sacks? Okay, the easiest question is probably the number of sacks, and it probably is about 160 right now. We've started out before Dick helped us build this beautiful collection of sacks, and we probably had 10, and most of those were the plain ones. We do have one Kansas State Agricultural College set of 4 sacks, 100-pound flour sacks from the flour mill that we have here on campus. And it was from about 1900. So that's pretty cool. But he helped us build this entire collection. And so we're still looking for sacks from various mills in Kansas. And if you have one that you wonder if I have it, I would suggest contacting me by email, and we can correspond that way. But I manage a 17,000 piece collection of clothing.
Wow.
It's huge, and it's stored in a very small space. So at the end of my PowerPoint, if I can go back to sharing my screen, well, you'll be able to see it on YouTube if you go there. I include some images of a couple of images. Whenever the campus kind of gets back to normal, I do welcome tours. But right now, because of budget cutbacks, I'm only working 1 day a week. And so limited amount of touring ability, but I do welcome small groups to come, and I love sharing the stories behind the garments that we have. And the reason we have a collection there in a museum is because we have an apparel program. We have both design and merchandising, as well as an interior design program, and it's there for students to use as inspiration for their work and study. Did I answer all the questions?
I think so. I think that's all the questions we had. What an interesting presentation. So I have to admit, before we got this exhibit and before I read through the exhibit, I knew nothing about this practice. So it's fascinating to me. It's really interesting, and lots of great questions tonight from the audience. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.